So you want single acting cylinders on your Oliver tractor, whether it be blue, green, or purple, or some of you insist pink. But let's dive into that and see what we can do to help you out. Well, since someone asked about the single acting hydraulics on a 770, get my shadow out of the way here. Here is your return port. This is just returns the sump. So if you take that plug out, most of the oil is going to come pouring out. But the easiest thing to do is to take, let's see, this round one, I believe, yeah, this is your restrictor swivel. This one's just free flowing, either direction. Generally, you want to lift with the restrictor one, but depending on which way you want your handle to work, take your hose and plumb it back into there, and then you should be good for single acting. It's the simplest way to do it. It's really the only way to do it on this system. If you want to make it for quicker hookups, yeah, shadows are terrible in here. Want to make it for quicker hookups, you could put, this is 1/2-inch pipe thread. You could put a male Pioneer coupler or whatever style you're using, male tip, and then when you want to use something single acting, you can take the one hose out of the coupler there and just bring it on and couple it on right here, and boom, you're good for single acting, and you can unhook it real quick and go back to double acting without too much work. That's the only provision in this style of hydraulics. These ones, your fleet lines, 66, 77, 88, supers, and super 66 through 88, and 660 through 770, and even some of the 990s. If you're putting a single acting on a 66, the best thing to do is pick your one, and then the other one, you want to drain the system first. But on these, there's a return to sump, so the oil is on the other side of that. That's why you want to pump it down. But take your hose and just run it right back into that port, and then your that'll keep the relief from blowing. When you're going down, the pressurized oil just returns back to reservoir. They did make a one-way restrictor that was mostly intended for loaders, so that that extra weight would make the oil return fast, and you put that in and it would kick in and restrict it so your loader didn't slam down on you. So from things like Haymowers and stuff, that ain't really necessary. A guy could get a one-way restrictor that you could put in the line if you can't find an original one. If you do have a really heavy implement that it's going to slam down on you. And of course, some of these have a restrictor built in, like this one. You're at least the jam nut, turn that in, and that will restrict it, but it also restricts it in both directions. When these were new, and these are new old stock here, yellow was the one-way restrictor for your loader. Those are hard to come by. And red was the variable restrictor. And so you would have one green and one red, and so you knew which one was which. Later on, they changed the shape to more rounded for the one with the restrictor, and the other one was free-flowing. If you have a 55 series with closed center hydraulics and the valves over here like this, you don't have to do a thing. Just plug it into one of them and use your lever like normal. The other side just won't do anything. It'll pressurize, but you can safely just hook up one side. Another setup is like we have on Herman. Don't see too many of these here in Michigan. Is the external valve hydraulics. And they look a lot like the closed center valve, but they're an open center. And they even made one for single acting that only had one port on it. And it was built internally so that when you open the valve, pressurized oil would return to the reservoir when you were doing your lower and go to the remote when you were raising. I've never seen one of those single acting valves in person. Of course, like I was saying, not too many of these here in our part of the country. And I have not tried this with a single acting with that particular valve to see how well it would work. I'm sure it's going to blow the relief valve on the lower cycle because the oil has nowhere to go to. So it just depends on how much a guy wants to put up with that. It's going to make extra heat and noise. Maybe someone out there watching has one of those single acting external valve remotes. If you do, please comment. I'd love to see one or hear that there is one out there, but it's in the parts book. Single acting cylinders for your 4-digit tractors. I'm hooking the 1850 up to the Haymower, which has a single acting cylinder for the left. And there's a couple ways to do it. One way that the book recommends is turning this bolt here out a few turns, and then there's a jam nut that's also a seal, and turning that back in to reseat it. Downside of that one is it turns your 3-point hitch off, bypasses it, and so your arms go down and stay down. The other way to do it is if you got one single acting and one double acting like this Haymower does. There are a couple of ports up here, and they moved them around over the years a little bit. On this early 1850, you got the restrictor, which is back here. I think later on it got moved up a little bit, but it's easy to tell because it's got this large hex plug that it screws into. That's your restrictor. Then you have your interlock bleed screw, which that's just a 3/8 stud. It's got a point on the inside end. 3/8 nut, that's a special nut that has a seal built into it. And because of that, I'm not going to break this one open because I don't want to crack paint and stuff. And but what you do to turn on a single acting is break the nut loose, turn this out 2-3 turns, and then turn the nut back in and seat it down. Chances are then it's going to start leaking because the old sealing material inside the nut is gone bad and is going to give up. If you've got 2 double acting, there's the same thing on the other, or I'm sorry, 2 single acting remotes. Same thing on the other side. If you watch right in the casting, usually there's so much dirt and crud down here. The words base and rod are actually cast right into the housing. So this back one is what you would hook to your base of your cylinder, so that when you pull the lever back, the cylinder would go up. And that way when you go down, you can adjust the restrictor so that if you got a heavy implement, you loosen that jam nut, turn the screw in. So if you're getting a lot of chattering when the implement goes down, you need to turn this screw in. Well, I'm just getting dirt everywhere. Turn that screw in, and that restricts the return flow of oil and keeps that chattering from happening. So we will hook up to that one. I just need to grab the right hose here. I'll show you in a moment here why. Yes, that's the right one. Let's see. Yeah, that's the top one. Thought that's the way I plumbed it. Why I'm not going to crack stuff open. Yeah. I've got touch-up paint. That's just a little grease off my glove. This is why I wear a shirt instead of running around naked, so I can clean all my tractors. But the reason I am not going to crack it open, the Gale, this particular model of Gale, and a lot of them, lifts the whole mower and not just the head. So you've got the whole weight, and all that weight on it keeps it down. The reason your mower drifts up on you on an Oliver is the way the system works. There's always a residual of 500 to 800 pounds of pressure in there. And with a double acting and 2 hoses, they counteract each other, and the net result is 0. With a single acting, you've got that little bit of pressure on there, and that's kind of also what makes them hook up difficult. And Haymowers have the head counterbalanced with springs. This is in the ups position, so it's still got weight on it. But essentially, it only takes like 50 pounds, 50 to 100 pounds of lift force to make the head come up when it's down on the ground because of the spring counterbalances. So that little bit of pressure that's in the system is enough to make your head slowly creep up when you're lifting just the head that's got the spring counterbalances. Well, let's fire Ophelia up and see how well she lifts and lowers this. Basically the same hydraulic system as the 1655 that I used last year, so I don't anticipate any issues. She lifts all right, in the right direction. Put the transport locks down, see how it lowers. Slow. There it goes. Well, I wonder what the deal was there. Granted, I have not done anything with the hydraulics since I painted it. There we go. The drawbar a little higher than the 1755 did. So loosen up these springs or the head ain't gonna touch the ground. It's a matter of adjusting that right there, but I think she's gonna work. I happen to have a hydraulic cover around from either a C series or an early 50 series. My guess is probably they switched it because it's got the smaller plug here, which kind of keeps you from doing power beyond. So you have to switch covers. Ophelia has that style cover. But to do single acting, as I mentioned earlier, showing with her, normally the interlock bleed screw is there. To use a single acting cylinder, you're going to want to loosen the jam nut on the interlock bleed screw, not the restrictor, and just turn it out 2-3 turns and then tighten the jam nut back down, which also has a seal built into it, and chances are that old seal is going to leak on you. If you only got one single acting cylinder, always put it on the right side. It just works better that way. If you got two, there is a screw hole on the other side, or a interlock bleed screw. And to better explain what's going on in here, because the other complaint I see online and have been asked about is if you got a heavy piece of equipment, especially at lower RPMs, it will shake on its way down. And you can adjust that with this restrictor, and you actually want to turn it in. Some people think you're not getting enough flow, and the problem is, in some ways, yes, but your return flow is too fast. So what I need to do, show you what's all underneath here before I start tearing things apart. These are coils for the hydroelectric that energize when you push or when you hit the lever, if everything's working right, which most of them have been cut off or whatever. And the solenoid makes a pin drop, or forces a pin down, and that keeps the spool in place, drops into a groove on the spool and holds it in place until the cylinder either gets out or back against the stop, and then that cuts the circuit. Going one way cuts the juice, the other way cuts the ground, and then the solenoid loses power, And so the pin comes back up, and then the springs can push the spool back into neutral and does it all automatically. Pretty simple once you know how it works. There's this one's busted up. There's supposed to be some switches in here and been banged around a little bit, but so this stuff, these spools go out the back side, but the roll pins here, they engage the levers, and they're just, I do believe, a little bit wider in the hole. So I need to drive the roll pin out on one of these in order to get it to come out the back side. So I'll do that real quick. Roll pin is out. That wasn't too bad. So now I will take my roll pin and just let it fall out, because that's the mood I'm in. We'll get this cover off the back here. You will find a couple steel balls. Those are what keeps your implement from settling when you've got the lever in neutral. And we'll show you that in a moment. And inside there is a seat in there. Hopefully you can see it. And that does have an O-ring on the outside of it, and then the steel ball seats against that steel seat to hold pressure in. There's a hole over here that directs oil through this restrictor on this side, and then there's a hole down below that sends it down to where the remotes are plumbed in. So let's see, we need to take out a snap ring to get one of these spools out of here. This is just for demonstration purposes, but and educational purposes. That's it. Snap ring out. Now it should, and of course I picked the snap ring on the wrong side. We'll just take the other one out too. Other snap. Now the spool should slide right on out. So there's your spool. Oh, I had to change one of these on the 270, which is actually a detent style, not the hydroelectric. But there was a little piece of spring caught in one of the holes or between one of the lands here. And so it would let the spool move one way, but the other way the spring would catch against the inside of the housing and would not move at all. I finally had to force the thing out of there. It ruined the spool. Fortunately, I had another one around, but it didn't seem to bother the housing too bad. And I put the other used spool back in, and she's been working great. So we're gonna be happy with that. All right, I'm gonna flip it back over again and remember which side I'm working on this time. This is an 1.5 inch nut, and I got an 1.5 inch socket, but I only have that in 3/4 drive, and that's too thick of a wall to get in there. So we're gonna use the handyman's secret weapon, not duct tape, the crescent wrench. It shouldn't be too bad. It's just straight threads with a copper washer behind it to seal it. And then it has this long spacer pin on it. Like I say, in a copper washer. It's a paper type of gasket washer. You really have to have the cover off to service that, because stuff could fall down in, I guess, is the short and skinny on these. Maybe if you get in there with a magnet. Okay, I carefully drove from the back side forward, and this comes out with the spring, which I think there's supposed to be a spring in the back side, which, you know, that cover's been off, so those parts are probably missing. But you got your ball and your spring. Okay, so that came out this way, which if you'd done that with this cover on, it would have promptly fell down in the hydraulic reservoir and there'd be money in the swear jar. So now I'm going to go the opposite direction and drive it out the back. There we go. Just gotta get it back in its bore. So here's what's going on. We'll start out with your remote valve being in neutral. So I'll just tip that up just to demonstrate how the balls are seated, because there's a spring in here and there should be a spring on the back side that keeps them in their seat. So your implement won't lower or raise. Okay, we'll start with neutral. So your lever is untouched in the middle. Each ball is in its seat, preventing oil from moving. The nature of these olivers, there's always, on these open centers, there's always some pressure from the oil flowing through, a few hundred pounds, 500 to 800, somewhere in there. And part of it's because of the steering system. You gotta have enough to make that work. And so a little bit will bleed through and get past the balls, because all it's holding them is this weak little spring. They mostly rely on the hydraulic pressure once they're in their seat. The more weight is against it, the harder that ball is pushed in there and the better it seals. But a little pressure will get by that on both sides. And that's why your hydraulics are kind of hard to hook up, because just that residual pressure that's always in the system. The best bet is to get the lever lock style of couplers. They're the Pioneer, I believe, 9250 style. If you're looking for them online or at your local supplier, those actually shut off the flow at the coupler and just make hooking up these olivers a lot easier. That's about the only solution, because it's just kind of the nature of the beast. A good quality coupler will make all the difference in the world. From whatever you do, don't buy the 4250s. Those are really bad about hooking up under pressure. Okay, so we're in neutral. Both balls are seated. Your implement ain't going up or down. You decide to lower it. So we move the lever, moves the spool. All right, well, what that does, it doesn't actually send the oil to the remotes. The oil has been going through. Oil comes in here and goes through, it comes up and goes through both spools, comes back forward and goes down to the 3-point hitch right here. So oil's going through, all happy and everything. You move the lever. Okay, now it redirects oil, and we'll say it shifts the spool this way. Well, what that does is this tip pushes the ball out of its seat. This is the return side now, and this one's like this, and this is the pressure side. Well, when you've got a couple thousand PSI against that little spring, that's going to unseat the ball on this side. So oil goes out, the pressure of this spool moving over opens up the valve so oil can come in. Your cylinder does its cycle, and then when you let off the lever, kicks back into the middle, pressure is equalized, kicks back in the middle, spring pushes the ball up into its seat on each end. You're back in neutral, nothing moves. You go the other direction, now it shifts it this way, kicks this ball out. The pressure pushes this ball out against its spring in there, and the process goes the other direction. When you open your interlock bleed screw right there, it's only going to work in one direction, which is what you want anyways, and it's going to be the one with the restrictor on it. So you push it one way, oil goes out to the restrictor and lifts your implement that's a single acting cylinder. It still kicks, we'll say it goes this way, still kicks the ball out, but since there's no return oil, nothing happens. Go back to neutral, it's in the middle there. And then we go the other way to lower our implement. Okay, that shifts this over so the oil can start returning. And this one, since that screw is open, you got the pressure on this side trying to go out to nothing. But since this interlock bleed screw's been turned back 2-3 turns, that opens up a port that lets the oil just dump back into the reservoir, and it works like it should. The oil returns, the oil that's being pumped goes to the reservoir, and everybody's happy, everything works. Okay, now if you got a really heavy implement or a loader, here's what happens when your implement is starting to bounce on its way down. Loaders are the most common. You shift your valve to raise the loader. That usually ain't an issue. Everything works fine. It's when you lower your loader, it bumps that open. Oil's coming back through the restrictor, through here. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's coming back. Anyways, it's coming back through there. And pressure is going out to your lowering end of your rods. Well, with all that weight on it, the oil can come in fast enough to actually push that spool back in the middle and reseat this ball. The pressure is still going out the other end, but all of a sudden the return line is blocked off. And so you get that, it stops for a moment. Well, then the pump catches up with the flow and pushes this spool back over here, opens the ball back up, the loader goes down a little more, that oil rushing in, pushes it back, reseats it, and so you get that bang, bang, bang. So what you do is you turn this restrictor in. I've seen where people say, oh, I ain't got enough flow. And it's actually, that is partially true. You don't have as much outward flow as you do inward flow. So there's two solutions. One is rev the tractor up, increase the output of the pump. That is going to keep this push back against the flow that's coming in. And it smooths back out. If you want to use your loader at lower RPMs, then turn this restrictor in. And it's something you got to play with. You know, do about a turn at a time. And what that does is slow down the incoming oil so that it doesn't kick this back out and stop the flow, kick that ball in, give you that jerk. And that's kind of a balancing act. On my 1750, we've got it to where at an idle, especially if you got a bail on it, it's going to do this. And even without a bail, it will, but you rev it up just a little bit, and then it smooths back out because the pump flow is fast enough to override or keep everything in balance. And that's the trade-off. The more you turn this restrictor in, it's going to slow your loader down because that's restricting in both directions. So you kind of got to figure, okay, I don't want it running wide open, so I'm going to adjust it in some. I think we've got ours where even with a round bail on, around 1500 RPMs, it comes down smooth, doesn't jerk, and faster than that, it works fine. With a bail on, you start getting down, you know, that 1300, 1200, and I'll start getting a little bit of, it's not as bad. But if I turn it into the point where I can do it smooth at an idle, I'm going to lose that lifting speed I want. So that's kind of the compromise we came up with. Just play with it until you get to a setting that you like, but it can be smoothed out. The ideal thing is to do like I did with Allen's and add a power beyond, and then put an external valve on, a spool valve. A nice loader joystick single lever valve is awesome. That's what we did for Allen. And that runs his loader nice and smooth. He still has his remotes for other things, and just kind of eliminates the whole jerkiness. So you keep the speed up in your loader and still have your remotes. Kind of best of both worlds, but you're also looking at several $100s by the time you buy a spool and hoses and everything it takes to plumb that in and hook it up to your loader. So something to consider. On these, they have a seal built right into the nut originally. And of course, after years of going at it, that seal is going to be dried up. So when you crack it loose to adjust that screw, probably it's never going to seal again. You might get lucky. I get these nylon lock nuts, and of course they'll thread right onto this one. The interlock bleed screw is bigger on the outside, so you have to, what I do is thread this onto a bolt. You don't want to use a tap because you'll actually cut nylon out. You want as much material in there as possible to seal the threads up in there. So but by running a bolt through it first, it sets those threads into the nylon. Then when I run the interlock screw into it, which that'll screw out all the way, no problem. Just thread it out until it comes out. Nothing's gonna fall out. And then once you got your threads set into the nylon, thread your interlock screw, get a copper washer, a 3/8 copper washer. Should be able to get that in any decent hardware store. Put your copper washer on the back. That seals the back side of the nut. The nylon seals the threads, and you should be good. The other thing they had that White offered as a final replacement, just because it was such a leak issue. There's some on my 1655, so I'll get imagery of that. Yeah, I was just driving the 270 around, and that's just as convenient. But here's those hex covers. You're saying they're solid on the end, they're threaded on the other end, and there's just a copper washer in there, and as you can see, they do a very good job of sealing things up. This one's the restrictor, and there's the interlock bleed, or for the one-way cylinders. Not so much as even seeping. I will look online and see if that's a current part. Another thing a person could do is you can get, these are called a connector nut, and they're thread, or you can get a connector nut rather. It's different than this because it's threaded all the way through. Then you could just put a bolt and a copper washer on the outside to cap that end off. More pieces, but effective. If you're wondering what the spring on the back of the main spool is, when you push the lever back and the rod spool goes back, there's that snap ring I had to take out. It pushes against, that's a pretty strong spring. This washer, this is basically what centers up your spool when you let go of the lever. You got that, and then the same thing the other direction. There's this washer on the front. It hits against the housing in there. When you go forward, it squishes the spring. So when you let go of the lever, it pulls it back. And then if you got hydroelectric, there's these two grooves here, and the pin from the solenoid drops into one of those two, depending on which way you're going, to hold it in place. And then once that current's broke by the cylinder, the pin comes out, lever goes back to neutral. Something else that can go wrong on these, someone's already robbed a couple of them out. They have these thermal relief valves. They're a single-use thing. Not too often they go. I personally haven't had to replace them. I believe they're still available, but they're still expensive. Two have been taken out, but there's one for each side. And essentially, you've got oil trapped in your remotes, and there's a possibility things warm up enough, they could actually, the oil could expand enough to create too much pressure. So this is a safety thing, and this little cap in there will burst at a certain pressure, and I don't know exactly what that pressure is. And when it bursts, there's no resetting it. You have to pull this cover off, take that out, and put a new one in. A person can put a pipe plug in there and you won't have any more protection, but at least I guess if you can't get these for some reason, you can make your tractor usable again. If you're mowing with a Haymower that is suspended by springs, only the head is lifted, unlike my Gale that we saw earlier, where it lifts the whole machine, you may find that your head creeps up, and that's, I don't know of a way to stop that. And that's just that, but like I was saying, the residual pressure, when you've got those counterbalance springs to help your head float, it takes very little pressure to start lifting that off the ground at first. And so when you've got single acting, you've got 500-800 pounds that's just kind of bled through the system because of the residual pressure in there, that'll slowly bring the head back up. It won't get all the way up because it takes more pressure as it gets higher. The springs are pulling less. And so honestly, I do not know a workaround for that, short of some kind of check valve that you could get that would open only at certain pressures, but it's got to be a two-way. I personally don't know of something like that. Maybe someone else does and has tackled that problem. Gary, maybe you ran into it and can put something in the comments. So that's it. That's how double acting cylinders, single acting cylinders, adjusting your restrictor, and why it does what it does. I appreciate everybody watching, and we'll see you in the next one.